Welcome to another episode or another podcast of True Tales with Ti-Hua Chang. So today I want to talk about one part of my favorite story of all time. My favorite story of all time is when I helped jail the assassin of civil rights leader Medgar Evers. He was assassinated in June 12th of 1963, shot from behind, from 200 feet away, and he crawled 38 feet in front of his house to die at his front door in his wife's lap in front of his 3 young children. And he was the head of the NAACP in Mississippi in 1963, which was deeply racist then. And I helped jail his assassin, Byron De La Beckwith. But I want to tell one part of that story. I was an investigative producer at ABC News at the time, and they actually sent me down to Jackson, Mississippi. My supervisor, Ira Rosen, cut a little clip out from, I think it was Newsweek, and it said that they will not go after the alleged assassin of Medgar Evers because there wasn't enough proof. He said, just go do this story. And I was supposed to do a story about how they'll never find the killer, never punish the killer. Byron De La Beckwith had been put on trial twice, and there were hung juries. And he was so obviously guilty. Like his fingerprint was on the gun, the scope, he had a black eye right where the scope is, and all this stuff. But even though it was Mississippi in 1963, an all-white, all-male jury, still, basically there's hung juries twice. That's how guilty he was that 6 white guys couldn't get themselves to vote that he was guilty or not guilty. And so I went down there many years later. It was 27 years later, and in 1990. And I had read about the assassination of Medgar Evers. It was one of the first stories I read in the New York Times, and I remember thinking how sad it was that he would be shot to death from behind and crawl 38 feet to his front door. There was a blood trail 38 feet, and die in his wife's arms in front of his kids. Just for trying to get, voting rights for African Americans. And, Medgar Evers was a World War II combat veteran who actually had stormed the beach at Normandy as a U.S. Army soldier. And yet, when he came back to America, he couldn't even vote. So, anyway, one portion of this story is that I needed to try and find out, I needed to find some evidence. I needed to find witnesses who saw this assassin of Medgar Evers, Byron De La Beckwith, either near or somewhere like that. And I thought about it, and ironically enough, years ago when I was in Detroit, because the Detroit Police Department would not give any information to the media because they thought the media was too biased against African Americans, I became my own investigator. I went and got a book at a federal bookstore that said how to investigate a crime, and pretty soon I was, checking for forced entry, checking for H pattern, after an event, and interviewing people, and pretty soon homicide detectives would ask me, would they tell you? And I go, would they tell you? And pretty soon got tight. So over the years I got training as an investigator. Forced training, not intentional. So I thought about it, and I said, if I were a killer, how would I kill Medgar Evers? How would I kill a public figure? And I thought, I would go to their last public appearance, and I would follow them home. You have to realize this is way before the internet, 50 years before the internet. And people don't know where everybody lives. You don't know the address of everybody. You have to follow them. So how do you follow them? Well, Medgar Evers, as the head of the NAACP, was a public figure. He makes speeches. I would go to where he's making a speech, and I'd follow him home. So I had a copy of the trial transcript from the second trial, the actual carbon copy, when they used to type on typewriters, and you have one piece of white paper, carbon paper, and then it would make an impression on the second page, the white page, and that's called a carbon copy. And I had the actual physical copy of that. And I read through the trial transcript. And then I found something that he had been to this one Baptist church at 9:30 that night that he was killed. He was killed about 11, or a little bit after that. And I thought, I'm going to go to that church. I'm going to see if I can find either evidence, even though it's 27 years later, or people or something. So I go to this church, and it's a Sunday. Just coincidentally, I went there on a Sunday. And I don't know, maybe it was closed during the week or something, but I went there on a Sunday, and I went during Sunday service when it's open to the public. And I'm sitting there, and apparently there's a Baptist tradition that if you are a visitor, you have to stand up and say who you are and sort of introduce yourself. Now, as a journalist, I probably, I don't know how ethical it would be to stand up and say, who I am, because then am I getting too close to the story? But, these people were so nice, and they're very polite, and they were mainly elderly, and I thought, I would be disrespectful if I didn't stand up and say who I was. So they saw me. I'm not only the only non-black person, I'm the only Asian person there. I'm the only non-black person there. And so I stand up, and then they say, well, my name's Ti-Hua Chang. I'm an investigative producer from ABC News. I said, I'm here to do a story on Medgar Evers. People just nodded their head, and then I said, and I've done thousands of stories in my career already, and there always are two sides. And I said, except in this case. In this case, there's one side, it's Medgar's side, and that's the right side. And a couple of people said, amen. And then I started talking a little more. And, I'm a former anti-war activist from college, and now all of a sudden I have a little pulpit. And I'm talking about, civil rights and this, and people going, amen, and amen, and pretty soon, there weren't that many people in there, maybe a dozen or so, and they're going, amen, like this. Anyway, then I finally sat down, and I figured, okay, and I crossed the line a little bit too much here. I'm supposed to be preaching. So I sit down, and then when the sermon is over, a minister who I'd been talking to for 10 days already and never said anything to me, never revealed anything, told me I was here the night that the killer was here when Byron De La Beckwith was in the back of the church. And then I said, well, are you the only one? He said, no, he was there too. And he pointed to a guy named Willie Peoples. And then he also said, and those two women were here. And all four of these people came up to me only because I realized later they trusted me. And I then immediately called for a camera crew. I interviewed the minister, and I interviewed Willie Peoples. And Willie Peoples went to the back of the church, and he showed how Byron De La Beckwith leaned on the back of the church with his foot up like this, one leg up. And later in an interview with a white reporter in Mississippi, because Byron De La Beckwith refused to interview with me. Beckwith, when that white reporter left, stood exactly the same way but with a different foot. And I eventually pointed that out to the prosecutor in the case, because he couldn't figure that out. I said, just look at that video. And when they presented this to a grand jury, they actually froze the picture from my story of Willie Peoples showing how Byron De La Beckwith stood at the back of the church, right next to the picture from the interview with the white reporter from Mississippi, where Byron De La Beckwith had his foot up the same way, but a different leg. And that was the last thing they showed the grand jury, and the grand jury indicted Byron De La Beckwith. And that ultimately led to his conviction. And he died in prison where he belonged, instead of dying a free man. And postscript on this story, some of you are older, you'll remember a very famous commentator from 60 Minutes named Andy Rooney. He called me up And he's at CBS News, and I'm at ABC. And he was at 60 Minutes. And through Diane Sawyer's assistant, he got my number. And he calls me up, and I pick up the phone, and Diane Sawyer's assistant says, Andy Rooney wants to talk to you. And I'm like, whoa, Andy Rooney, you know. And I pick up the phone, I say, hello, and he goes, oh, hi, this is Andy Rooney. He says, that was a pretty good story. Too bad nobody saw it because they were watching CBS, you know, March Madness basketball. And I thought, oh, man. And he goes, so I'm just wondering, you know, how'd you get them to talk to you? Because I went and did that story like 10 years ago and nobody would talk to me. And in my mind, I thought, gee, I don't blame them. You're so nasty. And then I said to him, well, Mr. Rooney, maybe it's because they trusted me. And that was the end of that conversation.